We are now going to work on completing the square, which is the last and final way to solve a quadratic. It is the fourth way. There are a lot of steps that you have to remember to solve this, and in the beginning it'll seem a little overwhelming, but as we practice it and as you get used to it, you'll find that it kind of flows and you'll naturally memorize the steps. And essentially what ends up happening is we end up taking the square root of each side of the equation. And just like the quadratic method, this method will work for any type of quadratic. So the first thing is I just want to look at some basic equations and just talk about solving, how you would go about solving something like this, because this sort of comes into play into what we're doing. If I were to solve this, my only choice right here would be to take the square root of each side. And the reason for that is because the square root of x squared is x. Because it's saying if I take the square root of x squared, I want to know what times itself will give me x squared, which is x. I have to take the square root of 49, but you must remember that there's two answers, positive 7 or negative 7. So why don't you go ahead and pause and do number 2. It's very similar. Now that you've paused, you should have taken the square root of each side, and you've gotten g equals plus or minus 14. So there's actually two ways based on what I just showed you that you could do. Obviously the first thing we need to do is factor out the 3. Okay. Now what I could do is I could add 16 to both sides and take the square root of both sides like I just did. Or you could recognize this as a difference of 2 squares, which is actually technically the same thing. So we end up with x plus 4, x minus 4. And if we solve that, we're going to set everything equal to 0. We know that's going to cancel. And when we solve, I'm going to skip the step where I show it. We get negative 4 and 4. So I just want you to recognize that back here, I could have added 16 to both sides and gotten x squared equals 16 and taken the square root and still gotten the same thing. I could have gotten plus or minus 4. Just a little FYI. So why don't you try number 4 on your own, pause it, and when you come back, I'll show you what to do. So you should have tried it, and you should have factored out a, that should be a 9, sorry, a 6. I'm actually going to do this the easier way, where I'm going to add 9 to both sides. And this ends up canceling out. We know that it doesn't equal 0. And I get plus or minus 3. This is just to show you, this is not actually completing the square, but this is kind of just to show you a little bit of what it's like to take the square root of both sides. Okay, now we're actually going to complete the square. I don't have the steps listed on this little video. You have them right in front of you. I am going to read it. But for space issues, I'm just going to do what the steps say. So number 1 says the quadratic should be in the form ax squared plus bx equals c. So that is slightly different. The c needs to be on the right side. So that's the very first thing that you have to do. Okay, that is very important. Now we're going to identify b. So b is negative 6. We are going to take half of it. Well, half of negative 6 is negative 3. We are now going to square the -3, and that is going to give us 9. Okay? So now what we're going to do is now add the 9 to both sides of the equation. So my left side, I'm just going to tack it on the end because I can't combine it with anything. And on the right side, I get 16 because 7 plus 9 is 16. Okay? Now, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to factor the trinomial on the left, because now it's a trinomial, it is definitely factorable. And what you're going to find is that it's actually going to be a nice neat square, which is nice. So I have an x and an x. I need a positive 9, so it's definitely going to be 3 and 3, and I need them to add up to -6. Okay, so what you see is you have 2 of the same here, which is nice. So when it says, number 6 now says it can now be written as a perfect square, what that means is I can now write it like this, because I have the same thing times the same thing. Now it says take the square root of both sides. And just like I said earlier, if you take the square root of a squared, you're going to get just this guy underneath. But what you do to one side, you must do to the other. So over here, we end up with x minus 3 equals, and remember, plus or minus 4. I'm now going to bring this up to the top for space. Now this part is actually somewhat familiar. I'm now going to solve for x, but I have to solve it twice because I have x minus 3 equals a positive or a -4. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. Here I get x equals 7. And here I get x equals -1. So my roots are 7 and -1, and you can certainly check by factoring, if you can factor, but you can't always, so you can check by putting it into your calculator. Okay, so we're going to try another one together. So I need to check to make sure that my c is on the right, and it is. The next thing I'm going to do off to the side is I'm going to identify b, which is 4. I'm now going to take half of 4, I'm going to divide it in half, and I get 2. I am now going to square that 2, which gives me 4. It ironically ends up being the b. So now I'm going to add this thing to both sides. And again, on the left side, I just tack it on the end because it doesn't combine with anything. And on the right side, I'm going to get 10. Now I'm going to factor the trinomial on the left. I have 4, positive, positive, so I know it's all going to be positive. Works out nicely that it's 2 plus 2. So now I have the same exact thing times the same exact thing, so I'm going to write it as a square. Now I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and I get x plus 2 equals plus or minus whatever the square root of 10 is. So I'm actually going to leave it as a square root of 10 until I separate them. So now I have, actually let's just find out what the square root of 10 is. And we'll just round it for now. So if you use your calculator, we know that it is not going to be a perfect square. And my calculator is telling me that it is 3.16. So we'll go with 3.16. So I have x plus 2 equals positive or negative 3.16. Bring it up here. So I have x plus 2 equals x plus 2 equals 3.16. x plus 2 equals negative 3.16. Solve for x. And this is our solution. Something like this, I would definitely put it in the calculator and make sure you're getting the same answer. Okay, so let's work on example 3. I see that my C is not on the right, so I'm going to get it over there. Okay, I'm going to deal with the B. So my B is negative 8. I'm going to take half of that, and that gives me negative 4. I'm going to square that, and it gives me 16. So this is the number that I have to add on to both sides. Negative 9 plus 16 is going to give me 7. Okay, so the next step, at this point you should be stating what you think the next step is, or glancing at your notes, but hopefully you're getting to the point where you kind of just know what to do. You hear that? If you're going on the Yankee trip, you better go to the bathroom. So I think this is, let's see if I can factor this down here. 8 times 2, well, that's not going to give me a negative 8. 4 and 4, it's probably 4 and 4, right? When I add them, I both get a negative 8. So I'm going to write it as a perfect square. Now I want to take the square root, both sides. And we need the square root of 7, which is about 2.64, plus or minus. Add 4 to both sides, and we get 6.64. Add 4, 4, and we get 2.64. Wait, let me just double check that. I apologize. I'm not doing my integer rules. That is going to give me a positive 1.35. Okay. Okay, we're going to do one more together. Okay, so my B is 6. Divide that by 2, I get 3. Square that, and I get 9. Factor the left side. This looks somewhat familiar, part of it. That is now a perfect square. Take the square root of both sides. X plus 3 equals, and the square root of 11 is 3.32 plus or minus. and those are our roots. Okay, I'm actually going to have you skip number 5, just for the first time on your own because you end up getting no solution. So we'll go over number 5 in class. So on this one, what I want you to do is I want you to change this to a plus 15. If you don't, you're going to get no solution again. So if you do a plus 15, take a second, solve it by completing the square, pause. Now that you solved it, you should have ended up with 1.83 and 8.16. Okay, last and final one, take your time. Okay, and also I want to point out that number 6 and 7 said y equals, so when solving it you would change it to it being equal to 0, so you could add that 2 or the c onto both sides. So pause, solve. Now that you're back, you should have gotten x equals negative 0.22 and 9.21. And I would like to point out that for number 6 and 7, for the 5 bonus points that I promised on your quiz, you must have the work shown, and it must be completing the square. Okay? Please email me if you have any questions at all. See you guys next class.